Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Reeper in Death's Garden by Scare in the Box. The castle stood in the middle of the hill as a guardian of its ancestral grounds. Its high stone walls were now semi-covered by scaffolding, where workers were located to clean them of the mold and dirt that the years had left behind. A great carved iron gate that formed the entrance to the castle grounds had already been restored and gleamed in the low sun at that time of year. The most impressive thing, however, was not the castle itself. Its medieval architecture and renovated interior were splendid, of course. But the real attraction, the reason for it being restored, was its garden. Hemlock, bleeding hearts, English brooms, Nereum oleanders, echinotums, angels' trumpets. The most famous poisonous plants in the world grew on those grounds and caused more than one to fear approaching the castle. And of course, legends were not in short supply either. From vengeful ghosts to monsters hiding among the plants or in the small lake located in the middle of the garden, the stories of the castle were thousands, and all would be skillfully exploited to attract more tourists. Of course, none of these stories were true, or at least that's what Derek Hambleton, the botanist in charge of the garden specimens, believed. He was a man of science. He adhered to facts and experience, to everything that could be verified. Ghosts and monsters did not fall into that category. Throughout the day, Derek roamed the garden from end to end, organizing the different species, counting them, keeping weeds at bay, and organizing how each one should be displayed to future tourists. Most would be left behind protective fences, especially those with thorns, so that no one was accidentally punctured. He was also in charge of organizing the trails and directing the workers who had to make them. One night, when the workers were setting up everything to finish their day, Derek decided that he would stay for a few more hours. He needed to finish organizing some samples of poisons that he had extracted. "Don't do that, boss," said one of the workers, concerned. "Ghosts are mostly active when the sun goes down." Derek sighed. "You know I don't believe in ghosts, Bob." "They're real, boss," said another of the workers, looking into his eyes. "They're the souls in pain, the victims of these plants that you care so much for." The botanist shook his head and clapped the man on the shoulder. "I'm sure I'll be fine." "Good luck," several of the men said, greeting him as they departed. "See you tomorrow," Derek greeted them. "Good night, boss." When he was finally left alone, Derek sighed again and walked towards the castle. In one of the rooms on the first floor, the owners of the grounds had allowed him to set up a small temporary laboratory so that he could analyze all the poisons of all the plants that were in the garden, so that he could have the necessary antidotes in case some tourist suffered an accident. That's where he went. Before entering the castle, however, he stopped. He looked back at the garden. For a moment he had felt a strange and exquisite fragrance. A perfume. He couldn't identify it with any of the flowers in the garden, and he didn't see anyone anywhere that could have such a strong perfume. Without paying much attention to it, he turned back to the castle and continued on his way. As he climbed the massive main staircase, however, he smelled the scent again. It was so intense that he identified it as a woman's perfume. It couldn't be anything else. Perhaps one of the restorers was still in the castle. "Crystal?" he called. No one answered him. He continued up the stairs and headed towards his lab. All the lights were off, reassuring him that he was alone. And yet, the perfume was still there. It seemed to follow him. He wrinkled his nose, not sure what else to do, and closed the lab door. It wasn't an unpleasant fragrance, but he was bothered by not knowing where it came from. His laboratory was not very clean. It was a small room with a shelf full of books covered the left wall and a huge table against the right wall. On the wall opposite the door there was a window overlooking the garden, which had the windows open. As soon as he entered, he turned on the lights, revealing boxes stacked in the corners, papers scattered on the table, and vials of liquid of different colors and viscosities also on the table. He went to take one of the vials so he could analyze it under the microscope that was on the corner of a table. When out of the corner of his eye he could see something moving in the garden. He was surprised, since he knew all the workers had left, and it was strange for wild animals to enter there. So he put the vial back in its place and went to the window. There, between the plants, in the middle of one of the paths already completed, there was a figure. He narrowed his eyes so he could focus on it better. Who could it be? He was alone. He himself had greeted the last workers to leave. Besides, what was someone doing in those hours between the plants? It was strange enough for workers to go into the garden unsupervised, but even more strange that someone entered at this hour. Only he was so involved in his work as to stay at night in the castle. Derek stretched, sticking part of his body out the window so he could see better. The moonlight illuminated the figure fully, and from that angle he could tell it was a woman. He returned to his original position and pursed his lips, still wondering who it could be. He did not recall seeing any woman on the exterior restoration team. Perhaps she was one of the restorers inside, or someone who had gotten lost. For that reason, the botanist decided to return to the garden and start looking for her. It wasn't difficult. He knew that garden like the back of his hand. As soon as he identified the figure, which even at this distance looked mysterious, she was naked, and the mist, normal at this time of night, seemed to dance around her. Her pale skin looked like porcelain in the moonlight, and her long hair, black as midnight itself, fluttered gently in the blowing breeze. Derek couldn't help staring at her for a moment, unable to believe what his eyes were showing him. The woman, whose back was turned to him, moved her arms gently and in waves. The mist somehow followed her. It was mystical and mysterious dance, which Derek wasn't sure he wanted to interrupt with his presence or words. He stepped back away from her and back to the castle, leaving her alone with her strange dance. But she turned and stared at him. Derek instantly blushed. Her completely naked body seemed sculpted by the most skilled of Renaissance artists. He forced himself to look into her eyes, but as soon as he did, he knew he had signed his doom. For they were as dark as her hair, and deep and empty as the universe itself. He was instantly drawn to them, fascinated and at the same time frightened, a divine fear that made him shudder, but also step forward to approach her. She smiled at his reaction, beautiful and intoxicating smile, somehow full of desire and tenderness. She turned to turn her back on him again and waved for him to follow her. As soon as she started walking, Derek couldn't help but obey and follow. Her movements were as graceful as a classical dancer. Her feet seemed to float on the mist, and he walked behind her closer and closer, feeling that exquisite scent that he had never felt before. It's yours, the perfume," he began to say, but the thread of his thoughts was lost in the curvature of her back. His voice died in the grace of her movements. They walked through the garden, following the paths he had designed. They passed in front of all those poisonous plants, some deadly, others not so much. For a moment, Derek thought she was leading him towards the lake, but she wasn't. They headed in the opposite direction and somehow entered an area he had never seen. How could it be? He knew the garden from end to end. He'd memorized it. It was impossible. And yet there they were, in front of a crypt with architecture as medieval as the castle. Several tombstones were located around her, and the woman sat delicately on one of them, crossing her legs. Once again the mist danced around her, the moonlight reflecting off her white skin and causing Derek to feel intoxicated again by her, by the image of her and her fragrance. "Who are you?" he asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she offered her hand. He reached over and took it. Her skin was as cold as the stone she was sitting on. Her pale, pointed nails looked freshly polished. Derek laced his fingers through hers, causing their palms to touch. In that instant, pain invaded him, pain so stabbing it caused him to immediately let go of her and double over himself, holding his hand with the other, a stab right in the center of his palm, as if a hot needle had pierced it. Looking up again to ask what had been, he found himself alone. The woman had disappeared. He was only surrounded by the mist. The moonlight now illuminated a tombstone occupied by a plant he could not identify. Both its branches and its few leaves were white as marble. The thorns were prominent and sharp as those of Euphorbia milli, and they secreted a brilliant sage. And it was with them, it seemed, he had pierced his palm. He took several steps back, still cupping his palm with the other hand, pressing further on the wound area. This plant, like all the others in the garden, must be poisonous, and therefore he had to head towards the village as soon as possible. He needed a hospital, a doctor, and an antidote. His heart raced. He spun on his heel and started walking as fast as he could towards the exit of the garden and the castle grounds. He couldn't run. His legs didn't respond to him. He felt his own heavy breathing, and the air was taking time to reach his lungs. And each time he inhaled, he felt his chest muscles strain harder. His feet collided with each other, tripping over the small rocks that formed the path that ran through the garden. He fell to his knees and was unable to get back to his feet. He looked at his hands. The blood fell from his palm, the hole made by the thorn of that plant open like a buttonhole. His vision blurred and the world spun. He brought both hands to his neck, to his throat, as he tried to make his lungs fill with air. He puffed like a fish out of water, looking up at the sky. The moon was shining overhead with the stars all around it. The mist surrounded him, as if to dance with him, as it had done with the mysterious woman. He fell to the ground with a thud, his eyes still looking at the moon. He no longer saw. His open mouth was no longer getting air. Blood was still gushing from the wound on his palm. The mist received him into his arms, inviting him to the eternal sleep among those poisonous plants that had been his life and his death. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.